and welcome to a rather verbose video on silent film, because we're no strangers to irony here at the Oddity Archive. Well, in case you haven't gotten the hint yet, it is once again Silent Movie Day, September 29th. And given that I think I'm about as close as there is to a silent movie expert within this weird little YouTube reviewer sphere, and it is kind of close to my heart, that, I'm gonna carry the torch for this one for the foreseeable future. So anyway, this year's token silent movie episode was initially going to be on all those wackadoodle, cheapy, public domain VHS, predominantly VHS issues of certain silent films. But there's two films that were constantly cropping up on VHS on those cheapy tapes where the home video aspect is the least significant bit of weirdness. We're talking two movies that, from the instant they left the screen back in the 1920s, they've had just one long, warped afterlife. So, the two movies I'm going to discuss here are very common ones, and this will be old news to more silent diehards, but I do think it merits discussion, and also just to give you a kind of an idea of how close we're getting to seeing what moviegoers saw back in the 1920s. Yeah, let's tackle the two biggies. Metropolis from 1927, and Phantom of the Opera from 1925. Much has been written about the content of the influential 1927 quasi-sci-fi classic Metropolis. Much has been written about the brutal editing that it took at the time. Much less has been written about the cinematic purgatory it landed in between the early 1930s and late 2000s. Of course, Metropolis was, thanks to extra investment from Paramount and MGM, German company UFA's biggest ever undertaking and most spectacular failure. By the end of 1927, it had only earned 75,000 Reichsmarks, the then German currency, against a 5 million Reichsmark budget. And even by that early date, there had already been at least 3 different released edits of the film. When the film debuted, using director Fritz Lang's intended final cut, in Berlin, in January of 1927, it clocked in at 153 minutes when run at the intended 24 frames per second. Period reaction to the film was schizophrenic. Some sources say it went over spectacularly well, others say it was met with booing and laughter from the audience, and little in between. Regardless, the film was soon pulled. Meanwhile, in the US, Paramount felt that the film was too long, had too many subplots, and was simply too complex for most American moviegoers. As such, they hired playwright Channing Pollock to not only remove anything he felt was extraneous, but also rewrite the title cards, changing character motivations and such as he saw fit. The Pollock cut debuted on March 6, 1927 in New York City, running between 107 and 116 minutes, depending on the frame rate. Over the next 6 months, the film made the rounds across America's major cities to low box office and mixed reviews. The film was often praised on a technical level, but panned on a story level. Probably the most damning critique came from sci-fi author H.G. Wells, who effectively called it cliched, platitude-heavy, and muddled. In August, the film re-premiered in Germany, this time in Stuttgart, where it had been cut to more or less match the US version. The excised film was destroyed by UFA. Anyway, the film fared no better the second time around. In September, Metropolis belatedly opened in England, also in a cut similar to the US version. It tanked in England as well. I can only guess that the soon to be Third Reich liked Metropolis for its nationalistic streak, as the German government decided to try and give the movie at least 2 more runs in theaters. But of course, not everything lined up with their ideology, so the German government recut the film at least twice more. In 1936, in a rare moment of diplomacy, the now Third Reich responded positively to a request from the Museum of Modern Art, henceforth MoMA, in New York City for a duplicate of the film. By this point, the film was down to 97 minutes. For what it's worth, this cut did find its way into some public domain circles after UFA failed to renew the US copyright in 1953 and appears on some early VHS issues. MoMA's duplicate of the, if you will, Nazi cut of the film was returned to East Germany in 1986, by which point that particular cut was little more than a curiosity. As a bit of trivia, while I can't confirm that it's explicitly the German government cut, Thunderbird Films, a company that almost merits its own episode, was circulating an edit that matched the running time of that cut. The Thunderbird cut appears on the mid-80s Crown Movie Classics VHS and Betamax issues of the film, which features a gloriously inappropriate soundtrack. Getting back on track, starting in the late 50s, early 60s, communication began between the Russian and Czech film archives to piece together a better copy of the film. Apparently, the heads of the two archives were massive fans. Problem was that the two archives were oblivious to the total reworking the film had seen after its first premiere, and set about unwittingly recreating the US version of the film. As the Third Reich was taking hold of Germany during the early mid-30s, director Fritz Lang hightailed it for America. By this point, Lang was so embittered by the experience of Metropolis that he had disowned the film, destroyed some of his documentation surrounding it, and gave the rest away. In 1971, the East German Film Archive established contact with the now 80-year-old Lang. Their reason for contacting him was that they had found some apparently excised footage and alternate takes. To the best of his memory, Lang attempted to guide the archivists, but their reconstruction was still horribly fragmented. Having said that, it did get an in-house airing at the Bucharest Film Archive in 1972. This wound up being the only restoration Fritz Lang would live long enough to have a hand in. He died in 1976.
Zufallsereignis gewesen. Ich war zu einem Besuch in Stockholm.
Around 1980, the first in a long string of freak occurrences happened. Somehow, the Stockholm Film Archive had come into a large collection of German censor cards from the 1920s. The significance being that these cards were painstakingly detailed, featuring a full transcription of all title cards, most plot points, the length in meters of each reel of film, and other details. German film archivist Wolfgang Klau visited Sweden during the early 80s and visited the Stockholm Film Archive. They obligingly gave Klau a tour of the facilities and showed him their file of old German censor cards, which Klau was unaware of. Better yet, they allowed Klau to dig through these cards. By some miracle, the November 1926 pre-release censor card for Metropolis was in there. Armed with a copy, Klau returned to Germany, gave the material to fellow archivist Enno Patalis, who went to work on restoring as much of the original German film as possible. To do so, Patalis cobbled together copies of the Nazi by way of MoMA issue, an unreleased Russian edit, and British and Australian issues. In 1982, pop music producer Giorgio Moroder put up $200,000 American for the rights to the latest ongoing restoration of the film with the intent of giving it a then modern pop rock soundtrack, which he did. It debuted in August of '84. While Moroder's version reintroduced the original German plotline and featured a nice clean transfer of the film, he also continually sped up and slowed down the action to fit his music. He also replaced most of the title cards with subtitles, and added 80s music video-styled freeze frames, and added some heavily stylized segments based on then recently rediscovered stills where stretches of the film were still missing. The Moroder version, clocking in at a mere 84 minutes, was met with a resounding thud by critics and won 2 Razzie Awards, one for Freddie Mercury's contribution to the soundtrack and one for Moroder's instrumental score. Despite this, the Moroder version did manage to become a cult hit on home video and has since been remastered and reissued. If you really love 80s pop, give it a shot. Otherwise, just hit up the soundtrack album and cherry pick your favorites. None of them appear in their final and/or complete form in the movie anyway. For what it's worth, Bonnie Tyler, Pat Benatar, and John Anderson's contributions get my seal of approval. Call me a cynic, but I don't think Enno Patalis cared too much for the Moroder edit. Patalis stubbornly continued trying to recreate a pure as possible copy of the original German version, which he quietly premiered in Munich in 1987. This cut clocks in at around 109 minutes. In 1998, the F.W. Murnau Foundation greenlit another restoration of Metropolis, this time for the DVD era. This version was effectively a mix of the Patalis edit, a few minutes of footage originally deemed too damaged to use, now digitally cleaned up, period-appropriate recreations of the original title cards, production stills, and new descriptive title cards for missing footage. Somewhere along the line, a copy of the film's original score was found. As it turned out, the score helped time the film almost to the frame. Using a MIDI transcription of the score as a guide, and later a new recording, the latest restoration took shape. This version debuted in November of 2001 under the title Fritz Lang's Metropolis, Restored Authorized Edition. The following year, it appeared on DVD. The following year, it went into rotation on Turner Classic Movies.
Director Fritz Lang, and we're going to start with a very special treat. It's the U.S. television premiere of the newly restored version of Fritz Lang's 1927 silent fiction masterpiece, Metropolis.
Way back in January of 1927, an Argentinian film distributor happened to be in Berlin on business. While in Berlin, he attended one of the initial screenings of Metropolis. Impressed by the film, he struck a deal to release the film in his home country. The only change made was a translation of the title cards. The film was belatedly released in Buenos Aires in March of 1928. Somewhere down the line, a copy fell into the hands of a Buenos Aires film critic, after whose death fell into the hands of the Argentinian National Endowment for the Arts. Around 1973, their collection of 35mm nitrate films, which is notoriously volatile, was becoming too dangerous to store within their limited facilities. Instead of, donating to a film archive, they opted to merely copy their 35mm prints to 16mm, officially due to lack of funds. The film had not been cleaned beforehand. The title cards were removed to save film. The film was copied using a sound gate that had rarely, if ever, been maintained. The new film was poorly developed, and the damage is more than obvious. The decaying 35mm film was soon destroyed. In 1992, the Argentinian NEA's collection of silent films was donated to a Buenos Aires museum. It took until 2008, but the Argentinian Film Archive, which had been wanting to check that 16mm copy for many years, was finally able to get their hands on that print. As it turned out, it was a complete-ish print of the original January 1927 issue of Metropolis. In 2009, the print was scanned, and the, as of this episode, most recent restoration was underway. The score was re-recorded, the 16mm footage was cleaned up as best as possible, and the film is now within 5 minutes or so of a true restoration of Fritz Lang's originally intended cut. The complete Metropolis, as it's known, debuted in February of 2010, made the rounds of the art house circuit, where I first saw it, and made it to DVD and Blu-ray in time for the holidays. As of this episode, this cut remains in print. Barring the rediscovery of those last precious few minutes of missing footage, it looks like this restoration is the end of the line. Like Metropolis, The Phantom of the Opera, based on the novel of course, was one of those films that got recut quite a bit, but was already getting cut, recut, and reshot like crazy before it went into general release. In November of 1924, the original cut of Phantom was delivered, which at 4 hours was unsurprisingly shot down by the studio, Universal. The first test for a release version came in January of 25. The film was considered simultaneously too heavy, and the ending, in which the Phantom redeems himself at the strength of a woman's kiss, was considered silly. Comedy director Eddie Sedgwick, best remembered for his work with Buster Keaton, was brought in to reshoot much of the film and inject a little humor into it. This cut was tried out in April. Sedgwick managed to move the film a little too far towards comedy, and this version was rejected as well. Most of the original footage from the January screening wound up being reinstated, with the Sedgwick footage being used sparingly. This version premiered in New York City in September of 1925. General release followed in November. Despite some clunky moments and a mixed critical response, the film was a rousing success, turning a $500,000 profit in 1925 dollars, mind you. This edit clocks in at around 116 minutes when played at 20 frames per second. Starting around 1928 or so, and up through probably the late 30s, Universal effectively invented home video. High-end camera shops were often given a catalog for customers to order their own 16mm prints of some of the studio's titles. 16mm had been introduced in 1923. These prints were known to sell for around $20 a reel. At $200 for a 10-reel movie, that's about $3,500 in 2022 dollars. Nonetheless, some high rollers did order these so-called show-at-home prints. These prints were struck from the original master copies of the film to boot. And yes, Phantom was one of these titles. We'll get to the significance of this later. With the transition to sound in the late 20s, studios took the opportunity to reissue some of their back catalog, sometimes with just a musical score, sometimes with dialogue hacked in. Given the success of Phantom, Universal decided to not only reissue the film, but reshoot parts of it a third time, with proper dialogue in some places. This sound reissue of Phantom debuted in December of 1929, clocking in at around 95 minutes. Given that it was largely unseen until after the new year, this issue is often frustratingly alternately referred to as the 1929 or 1930 version. Again, these dates are used interchangeably. Anyway, this time around, the film was a modest hit. Here's where this film's history goes off the rails. As of 1929-1930, it was mostly only major and mid-sized American and European city theaters that had been wired for sound. Most smaller markets, certainly worldwide, were still stuck with tossed-off silent cuts of new movies. As such, for these markets, Universal added an awkwardly long shot of a man holding a lantern at the beginning of the film, seemingly addressing the audience to set up the film, possibly just reading off the title cards that started the fall 1925 version. The going theory is that this scene was to be narrated in person by either a theater employee or a local actor that just needed the couple extra bucks. Thing is, if there ever was a script, it's now lost. For what it's worth, the 60s Moviedrome issue and the 1990 Rick Wakeman scored restoration of the film attempt to recreate the Lantern Man scene. One with Moviedrome founder John Griggs narrating, and one with horror movie icon Christopher Lee narrating.
Here lie the chambers of death, where shadows linger and time stands still. Nothing moves.
Somewhere in the 1950 to 52 range, George Eastman House curator James Card requested a copy of Phantom from Universal to be preserved and possibly occasionally screened. The timing could not have been better, as Universal had recently deemed their silence to be, quote, of no further commercial viability, unquote, and to be destroyed. Whether it was for print quality reasons or if Universal simply didn't care, Universal sent along a copy of the silent version of the 1929 reissue. The Eastman House dutifully struck a 35mm copy of the print, and it's been the basis of nearly every restoration since. Getting back to Universal, they most likely destroyed their silence no later than 1952. To show of how little value these films were deemed, as best as I can gather, Universal never renewed the copyrights to any of their silence. As far as I know, the only surviving Universal silents are by way of archives and private collectors. Sometime in the 40s or 50s, film collector John Hampton had been hoarding every show-at-home copy of any film he could find. Hampton, who also ran a small theater, would take the best elements of each movie and, if you will, Frankenstein them together, then of course screen them publicly. As it turns out, Phantom was one of, if not the best-selling of Universal's show-at-home line. Unfortunately, Hampton's reconstruction is still missing between 2 and 5 minutes of footage, and the show-at-home prints were 100% black and white. It also turns out that when the 1929 cut of Phantom was made, Universal used footage from the foreign negative in some spots. Remember, during the silent era, studios usually made 2 copies of each movie simultaneously with the cameras right next to each other. Also, in other spots, outright alternate takes were used for the reissue. Whether Universal's reason for these substitutes stems from wear and tear making those show-at-home prints, or is just simple incompetence, is unknown. Regardless, the Hampton print, when stacked up against the 1929 version, makes for some interesting comparisons. Upon initial release in 1925, Phantom had a total of 3 color sequences: the opening opera performance scene, the masquerade ball, and a dye transfer piece of the subsequent scene. The first 2 scenes being in processed color, the Eastman print is in 2-color Technicolor for what it's worth, and the third scene by way of an obscure process known as Handschigel. Universal's 1929 print only retains 1 color sequence, the Masquerade Ball. The opening opera scene was reshot in 1929 in black and white, and the Handschigel footage reverts to black and white. As a point of amusement, some cheapy public domain copies of Phantom, which are usually sourced from duplicates of the Eastman print, retain the color Masquerade Ball sequence, albeit usually pretty faded. When serious restoration attempts began on Phantom in the 70s, largely spurred by the rediscovery of a clean copy of the Masquerade Ball sequence by historian David Shepard, almost all attempts were at restoring the 1929 silent reissue. Problem was, little effort was made to distinguish the 1929 and 25 versions. To make matters worse, the title card of the 29 reissues retain the 1925 copyright notice for no good reason whatsoever. And some restorations drop the opening Lantern Man scene to both more closely resemble the 25 cut and to tighten up the film in general. The 1996 Kevin Brownlow restoration is guilty of this. The Hampton reconstruction of the original fall 1925 cut has been reissued a few times now, most notably on the Kino 2-disc Blu-ray released in 2015. As for the 25 cut, it does retain more in the way of character development, but that's about where my love for it ends. Weird as it sounds, I prefer the restorations of the silent 1929 reissue. The pace of the film is much tighter, the takes chosen are often more effective, especially those with Lon Chaney, and the film loses a truly awkward and unnecessary epilogue. About 55 minutes of the Vitaphone discs that accompanied the US 1929 sound reissue do survive today. Problem is, given that the silent 1929 cut uses different footage in some places, the sound rarely syncs up. The aforementioned Kino Blu-ray does round up the audio, and they have resynced it when possible. Thing is, if the audio is anything to go by, the sound 1929 cut is pretty clumsy. The dialogue is awkward and often woodenly delivered. Also, not having a voice for the Phantom, but instead some messenger, and the constant drifting in and out of dialogue just feels careless. Only one reel syncs up decently, And of course, it's a stretch with no synced dialogue. Anyway, in 2020, the original color version of the opening opera sequence resurfaced, but as of this episode, has not been worked into any restoration of the film. To sum up, as of 2022, there is no known complete surviving 1925 cut of the film. There is no known complete copy of the 1929 sound reissue, and the silent 29 version isn't exactly pure either. So, pick your poison. Well, that's it for today's archive. Join me next time when I begin experimenting with bringing the archive's frame rate down to 18 frames per second. I mean, I'm still going to shoot at 29.97. I'm just going to slow down the playback. It gives YouTube more room for ads. And better yet, it gives certain viewers more room to complain that I speak too slowly.
Rollo, dear,
15.
did you like me tonight?
More than ever. You are wonderful.
Tell me, where did you like me best?
I thought the Pearl song.